Good afternoon. My name's David, and let me pull the camera a little bit closer. Um, I live in Texas, and I've been thinking for a while about getting into a podcast, and it just kept coming up to me in my awareness to do this, and so finally doing it, saying what I want to say. It may move slowly, but I want to get it out there. This changes in the world, changes in the planet, growth in my spirituality, red pill, the idea of understanding the real world. And that's what I want this podcast to be about, and just really something that helps people, because if it doesn't help people, then they'll certainly find something else that does, hopefully. But I just want to give my message. There's a lot of YouTubers out there that have great messages. Mine links up with them so amazingly well. And I just want to put myself out there to where, it might be helpful to somebody else, particularly somebody like me when I was 5 or 10 years ago or 15 years ago, because some of the stuff when you find out about how the real world works is really crazy. And I feel like I have an ability to portray that to people who would not normally accept that reality, bits and pieces. You can incrementally grow in that. There's a lot of great shows and movies out there that I like, that I've watched, that have I haven't always believed in completely. I've rejected some of those and different portions of them. Then other portions made sense. But then over the past year in which I've grown spiritually and I've come to understand the real world and how it functions, then bits and pieces, and I'm really a data rat, so finding different pieces of information, and you hear things over and over again, and I grow to that point where, yes, this makes sense. Now I can accept something that I couldn't accept before. And really, maybe let me back up just a second and say that my initial foray into spirituality was last year, 2019, right about this time frame. This is being recorded in June of 2020, and it was about April of 2019, that early spring last year, I was really into growing myself. I was into law of attraction. I was into diet, health, body. Started to learn about the energy centers, chakras, as I call them, energy centers, and movement, the importance of movement, Tai Chi, all this kind of stuff. Really just growth, and then certainly led to spiritual growth and consciousness as well. I remember at that time, there were they call them the three amigos, and I used to really love two of them. I really, and I was kind of into Tom Bilyeu's podcast, r.e.a.l. Excuse me. The r.e.a.l, London r.e.a.l, great show, and some of the shows like that. Aubrey Marcus, and I kind of found really that it wasn't. The three that I watched the most were Joe Dispenza, who was a guest on some of those shows. Started off really liking Wim Hof and learning about the body. That was eye-opening. He is amazing. But Joe Dispenza really was a huge influence at that time, and Bruce Lipton. So the third amigo, Greg Braden, I didn't really get him at first. I didn't understand Greg Braden. He was all over the place talking about history, and then one thing he said really made me scratch my head, which was that at a certain period in time, maybe 200,000 years ago, humans were going along in their evolution, and there was a major change, as though someone placed something into us, and then we immediately shot off on a trajectory. And that had made sense for myself from things that I'd heard, but it sounded too foreign, and I was too used to the conventional versions of evolution that, he made me nervous. Greg Braden was the one that really made me nervous, and so I kind of instantly rejected that, and I didn't go down that path of wanting to read much into him. But somewhere along the way, you get into the London r.e.a.l, the Tom Bilyeu's and stuff, and you get into, some of them are willing to go to places that are a little out there. The first time I saw David Icke, I was just like mind blown. In a bad way. It was like, no, this guy has got to be crazy, completely crazy, to say what he does. About the lizard people and shapeshifters, and it didn't make any sense to me. And so at that point, I remember around April or May of 2019, I became very interested in the topic of UFOs. I said, YouTube is amazing. There's so much content out there. I know if I just look up Roswell and I'm going to dig into this like I dig into everything else, I know I'm going to get some information. I know I'll be able to find out the truth about Roswell. So I looked into it, and there's some good stuff online and everything. But at the end of the day, the smoking gun to me was a documentary that said it was all laid out by the government of how this happened, and there was some company involved, and it was something like wasn't a weather balloon, but it was something like that was a program. They had been in a certain amount of privacy, top secret class for so many years, which is why the government couldn't share. And then finally in the 80s or 90s, I think it was, they were releasing this. And then there was this company that had made this thing that looked like extraterrestrial hieroglyphics, but actually it was a company from somewhere up in the Northeast. That was out there. And so that was viable. And I said, okay, case closed. There's no aliens. Roswell doesn't exist. But along the same time frame, May of 2019, I looked into the concept of remote viewing. And remote viewing was quite interesting to me because it was something that I just I felt like, for those who are not familiar with what remote viewing is, it's basically the idea that I can sit here, I can close my eyes, and I can go somewhere like, if there's a park nearby, and I can see what's happening there. I can see a man in a blue shirt, Okay, so that's the concept. And you can go anywhere. You can go off planet, you can go to China, you can go anywhere with this ability. And some people believe that it's real. So I'm going to talk through that. Came upon the concept. The claims were pretty amazing of what could be done with remote viewing. And, at first I'm a skeptic mindset, always very much a skeptical mindset. With that, there was another thing that I saw, which was I think it was a Vice documentary on the topic of remote viewing. It might not have been Vice, and they had interviewed Joe McMoneagle, who had claimed to be work for the government as a secret remote viewing spy through the SRI, Stanford Research Institute. And Joe McMoneagle sat down and gave them an example of a bridge in California, and he didn't know what it was, but he sketched it out quite accurately. And there were a couple other things in terms of, I believe there were twin brothers that were on separate floors that were doing different things, and they could understand each other. They knew what was going on. But and so my mind was blown with that Vice documentary, or if it wasn't Vice, whatever, whoever it was, that was pretty amazing to me. And at the end of that, I remember thinking, they said, this proves that remote viewing is not real. While so and so and so and so, this proves, and I was like, BS, man, that it is real. You just documented that it is real, and then you said that it wasn't. You can't pull the wool over my eyes like that. But they said it wasn't real, so that was kind of interesting. The other thing with that I remember hearing as far as evidence of not Joe McMoneagle, but another person who was with the Stanford Research Institute was Ingo Swann. I believe it was either Ingo or Pat Price, were both remote viewers, and they were hired by the government to look at different things. And one of them had looked at Saturn's rings and had discovered that Saturn did indeed have rings. This was way back in the day, like in the 60s or 70s. And they found that not until, I think he said there were like 7 rings or something like that. And not until many years later, 20 years later, did they find that exactly what he described of the number of rings and the exact type of atmosphere that he described on the surface of an exact consistency with which he described Saturn's rings was what the science had later found to be true. So pretty impressive stuff going into it. And that got me into learning more. So there's tons of stuff on YouTube. I listened to audio book of Ingo Swann's book. I apologize, I don't remember the name. And there were 3 really powerful things about Ingo Swann's book. I believe it was the only book he wrote. And it was from his days after it was declassed. And I think it was in the 90s. And he was with the project. He was doing some remote viewing of the Russians that we were dealing with at the time. And he basically had this, the 3 major things that I remember from that book, because they hit me like a ton of bricks, were he was asked to remote view the moon one day. And then another day he had an experience in a grocery store many years later. And then later he had an experience where he went with the team up to Alaska to look at a proposed UFO landing site. So I want to go through those in a little bit of detail here and the way that I came across it. Because remember, 2019, May of 2019, I was complete skeptic. I wouldn't say I wanted to it to be true or not. I just wanted to know the truth, like I think we all do. And so first thing Ingo Swann does is he doesn't know he's looking at the moon. The way it works, they give him certain coordinates. So he's on these coordinates, and they're asking him certain questions. This was someone that he didn't even know. They gave him a name and everything, but it was a special secret, top secret project. So he didn't know anything going in. And he says, this is another planet, as he gets into what he's doing. And he says, okay, I'm coming down on a surface. Is this the moon? This feels like the moon to me. And I think they answered in the affirmative. You can check out his audiobook to get the whole story. But then he's at a certain part of it, and he sees these beings. He sees these beings on the moon, and and then he describes them noticing him, and that there's vehicles, and that there's lights, and that there's like a construction site on the moon. this part that they wanted him to remote view. And so he's sitting there talking to him like, did you what are y'all doing? There's beings on the moon. And the person basically admits that that's the case, that there are ETs on the moon. This is maybe within 10 years of NASA's first initial voyage into the moon. And he's basically all but admitting that there's beings on the moon. So that was kind of that. It was a short story, but it got me into the there's a book that was in the 70s that was there are beings on the moon, and I forget the exact title and author, but I checked that out, and it talked about how NASA documentation has been fabricated and the pictures have been blurred out. It's all out there. It's easy to see. And so all kinds of red flags going off in my mind at this point about, not being able to trust NASA, who up to now had been, okay, they're trying to get to space using the space shuttle technology, but then it just brought in a lot of red flags for me. And honestly, that part of the story I believed. I felt that was believable, that there could be beings on the moon, and especially when you get some confirmation that NASA does indeed fabricate and blur these images. And there's books written at the time, and I looked into that, and it's like, well, this guy was actually an employee of a consultant of NASA, and he had access to that photographs. And so, of course, the government tried to conceal it and hush hush, but it was pretty clear that it was at least a few red flags. The second part, which was the most unbelievable part of the book, he was in a grocery store a few years later, buying some produce, and he said that he was in the grocery store and he felt all of a sudden the nerves on the back of his neck, when he came up next to a person, the nerves on the back of his neck, the hair on the back of his neck stood up. And it was an attractive lady that was buying produce, and he wanted to get close to her. He was attracted to her. And then, like a spidey sense, like a sixth sense, just completely freaked out. And it's like, whoa, this person is not human. And that was it. And then he walked away. And the government, top secret government center was working with him, was aware of that. And he did not, let me think how it went. He said they didn't notice him. He felt strongly, and they said that the lady was very dangerous, and never to come in contact with her. So my idea of this whole thing about shape-shifting, my mind stops and I can't go there. I just, at that time, a year ago, I could not go there. No. I somehow just blocked it out and said, no, I cannot possibly believe that is real. The third story was a little more believable, that he went up to Alaska with the team on a special 2-day visit. They wanted him to use his spidey sense, a remote viewing, to see what was going on in this place in Alaska. They get to this lake, this cold mountain lake, and all of a sudden it was dark, and there were all these lights that came down, and it was some kind of extraterrestrial landing, UFO sighting, and they had all kinds of problems. They had to run. They had to make a run for it. At first, reading the story, okay, you're running away from UFOs and they're shooting lasers and knocking down pine trees. A little bit hard to believe. But upon looking at other stories of extraterrestrial craft, I believe something like 40% of the population now believes in UFOs, and we almost all know somebody who has a. I guess the UFO part of that was not as unbelievable to me. I mean, I've seen things that could not have been planes, and it's definitely fathomable to me that you could have UFOs in the skies. I've heard, I mean, there's just so many testimonies, and I forget the original Benny and Betty UFO sightings, but it was pretty incredible and remarkable. Okay, so that was the Ingo Swann book, which was fascinating to me. Then I get into the Pat Price stuff, which he was another remote viewer, but was on some kind of different level where he really had this ability to probably be the best remote viewer on the planet. And he was the only one of them, I believe, that actually saw these mountains through these mountains remotely, and saw that these were actually alien stations that were underground. One was in Africa, one was in Alaska, and gosh, one was on Spain and France, and I can't remember the exact location. Was it Australia or somewhere else? But the the amazing thing was when I did, and I do research, so it's like, okay, the claim is out there, and then when you look at Africa, the well, for one thing, the Alaska situation, all kinds of data of missing people when they get around that thing. In Africa, the same thing historically. When you talk to the shamans you listen to those stories of Africa, and I didn't get anything on Spain and France. But he had data, he had information about what they're used for. Some of them more of like management facilities, some of them more military facilities. And the one in Alaska was very interesting because there's a lot of video of people going behind that mountain, not people, craft going behind that mountain. And so very, very fascinating. The more I dug into the remote viewing stuff, the more questions that emerged out of this. I guess the more I just said, I can't, I just can't not, I can't write it off. I really want to, like the Roswell thing was explained in my mind, but this, it was just too incredible. And I've had my own experiences over the years where I felt like I knew something. I just knew something. A certain person was outside, or a certain situation, then whatever it was, and it proved to be true. So I do believe what these remote viewers all say, that we all have this gift. So I had worked a little bit in the subsequent months after that to develop that gift. But the last thing that kind of took the cake for me, I had mentioned Joe McMoneagle. You watch Joe McMoneagle, and it's pretty fascinating. You can watch his videos on YouTube. In one, he's talking about a spacecraft because he remote viewed a spacecraft, and it was a reptilian craft, like people that look like alligators is how he described them. And he was on the ship with them, and they were aware of him. And in another case, he was asked, this was by the government, to remote view the planet Mars in the portions where they have the pyramids. And this was a million years in the past. He actually saw people, heard chanting and heard singing on the planet Mars in those pyramidal structures 1 million years ago. So, not saying that I didn't believe that in the beginning either, but remote viewing is proven to be accurate. I didn't give you the smoking guns, but I should before I end this video. But basically, these Russians, and I think it was Ingo or Pat Price were spying on the Russians for a lot of what they did, and they found that what proved to be a submarine manufacturing facility in a certain part of Russia, and described the exact type of crane it was that manufactured these, and described in detail that it looked like they were manufacturing steel orange. They were orange sliced shapes, but it was steel that they were fabricating inside the building. And sure enough, the reconnaissance from several months later, after these submarines were sent out, was that was exactly what was being built. And so that was, along with a lot of other things that have proven to be true, that remote viewing is something that we can't understand how we have it, but that we do have. And to me, that's okay, because we have electricity, for example. Do most of us know how it operates if we're not scientists or electricians, or a specific type of scientist or an electrician? No, we really don't. But do we pay our electric bill? You have to. You just accept that. Hey, okay. Do we know how these smartphones work? Not most of us, but so there's all kinds of things out there that every day we say, I don't know how it works, but I believe it. And so to me, after that point, May of 2019, I became a believer in remote viewing. And I guess really that's all I wanted to say. So